Welcome, friend. I'm glad you're here. If you find comfort in the slow unraveling of forgotten truths, in the soft sound of stories that drift through time like dust through a beam of light, then you've found the right place. Before we begin, I'd be grateful if you could press the like button. It tells the rhythm of this quiet world that you want more of it. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories just like this one, where history whispers instead of shouts. Now, before we descend into the quiet corridors of ancient memory, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Write your city or country down in the comments. I read every one of them, and it's a gift to know where this voice reaches. Now let's begin. Slowly, gently, with a breath that reaches across centuries. Because to understand the world of ancient Greece is to accept contradiction. The civilization that gave us poetry and geometry, philosophy and democracy was also a civilization where half the population women were confined by rules so strict, so strange, so quietly devastating, that even their footsteps were not entirely their own. These were not laws written in stone, though some were. They were expectations, customs, rhythms passed from mother to daughter, from nurse to child, from silence to silence, and they were everywhere. Sewn into the folds of clothing, into the way a woman sat, the way she looked, the way she breathed when men were near. In Athens, the so-called cradle of reason, a respectable woman was expected to remain out of sight. Not just metaphorically, but literally. The ideal wife was one who was never spoken of by name, whose presence was so quiet it became almost invisible. She could not walk freely in the agora, the marketplace where philosophers argued and merchants haggled. She could not sit at the same table with her husband's male guests, even in her own home. Instead, she stayed upstairs, behind veils and doors and silence, tending to the household, the loom, the children, the ritual obligations that marked the cycle of the moon. And it was not just what she did, but how she did it. A woman must walk without lifting her eyes. She must speak only in whispers. She must never laugh too loud or cry in public, for both were signs of disorder, of wildness, of the feminine danger that lay just beneath the surface of a civilized city. In Sparta, the rules were different, but not kinder. Spartan women were raised to be strong, to run, to wrestle, to bear sons who would die in war. But even this strength was not freedom. It was duty. It was designed. A Spartan girl was praised not for her mind, but for her womb, for her potential to create warriors. And even her public speech, rare and sharp, was measured against her usefulness to the state. Elsewhere in the Greek world, in Thebes, in Corinth, in the islands where wind and salt shaped lives, the rules bent slightly, but they never broke. Whether cloistered or trained, silent or stern, the women of ancient Greece lived under eyes they could not see, and expectations they could not question. And perhaps the strangest rule of all was this: a woman could be punished for being too quiet, just as she could be punished for being too bold. Her virtue was measured by a scale that changed with every man who observed her. She could be chaste, but not cold; graceful, but not vain; educated, but not clever. The balance was impossible, and that impossibility was the point. Because when a rule is designed to break you, no matter how you follow it, it ensures control. It ensures silence. And tonight, we are here to undo some of that silence, not with outrage, but with understanding. Not to judge from the height of modern comfort, but to sit beside those forgotten women in their quiet rooms, and to say, we see you, we remember, and we will tell your story, even if it was never meant to be told. To begin to understand just how strange the expectations placed on women in ancient Greece truly were, we must start not with laws or punishment, but with fabrics, with linen, wool, and silence sewn into folds. Because even the clothes a woman wore told others how she was supposed to behave, and what kind of woman she was allowed to be and not allowed to become. And these clothes were not chosen by her, not even by her mother, but by the long accumulation of invisible hands pressing tradition into every stitch, And so the peplos, the chiton, the himation, these were not fashion. They were armor, shields against suspicion, gossip, and danger, and yet never enough, because if a single shoulder slipped, if a veil stirred at the wrong moment, if her ankle showed beneath the hem, a woman could be accused of indecency, not for doing anything but for being seen too fully. And the irony was cruel. She was expected to be beautiful, clean, modest, graceful. But if that beauty drew attention, it was her fault, her burden, her shame. And this paradox shaped every part of her life. And so even her voice had to wear a kind of veil, not just in tone but in content. For an Athenian woman could not speak in court, could not own property in her name, could not write publicly under her own authorship. And yet she was expected to teach her daughters to do the same, to pass on the silence like an inheritance, like dowry, like duty. And in this passing of silence there grew entire generations of women whose thoughts were never written down, whose names survive only as wives of daughters of shadows of men. And still they endured, finding ways to speak in other forms, in embroidery, in ritual, in coded songs sung in the women's quarters, behind closed doors, behind drawn curtains, where their lives unfolded like thread, unseen but deeply woven. And the rituals were many and strange, and each one held a rule women had to follow, whether they understood it or not, like the Thesmophoria, the secret festival held only by and for women, honoring Demeter and Persephone, where men were forbidden to hear or see. And the women fasted and buried offerings and sang things the city never recorded. And this moment of autonomy was both sacred and suspect, because any gathering of women outside male supervision was considered dangerous, unstable, potentially corrupting. And so even sacred rites had to be done quietly, cautiously, as though freedom itself was something to be whispered rather than claimed. And even in marriage, where a woman's role was supposed to be most secure, the rules turned harsher still, because an Athenian bride was expected to marry at 13 or 14, to a man often twice her age, whom she barely knew, and her worth was measured not by her joy, but by her obedience, her ability to bear children, her skill at staying silent in front of guests and smiling at in-laws, and her entire identity changed with the wedding. New name, new home, new gods to worship, and no path back to the life she once knew. And still she was expected to be graceful, even grateful, for a cage wrapped in gold. And when she bore a child, especially a son, she was praised. But if she bore only daughters, she was pitied or blamed, as though her body had failed a state it never chose to serve. And still she sang lullabies, still she spun thread, still she kept the hearth alive. And for some women, this was enough. But for many, it was not, and that longing, the longing for more, was never acknowledged, only punished. And so they learned to hide it, to turn it inward, to carry it like water in a sealed jar, heavy and always full. And the strangest part of all was how society pretended these rules were natural, eternal, ordained by the gods, when in truth, they were written by men, by lawmakers, poets, philosophers who often feared the very thing they tried to control. And in their fear, they built walls not just around women's bodies, but around their minds, their movements, their possibilities. And yet the cracks always showed, because women found ways to resist, quietly, persistently, through myth, through motherhood, through the small acts of teaching their daughters to think while pretending not to. And these acts, though never recorded in epic or marble, were acts of survival, of courage, of deep, defiant memory. And they are why we can still speak of them now, across all this time, through the hush of history. There is a silence that hums louder than speech. And in ancient Greece, that silence wrapped itself around every woman like a second skin, an invisible garment worn tighter than any veil. And the deeper we go, the more we understand that these strange rules of etiquette were not just cultural quirks or odd customs, but deeply rooted systems of control. Rituals woven into daily life so tightly that they no longer felt like rules at all, only like air, a kind of air that suffocated without ever calling itself poison. And among the strangest of these expectations was the notion that a woman's body did not belong to her, not just in the physical sense, but in presence, in posture, in how she inhabited space. For she was taught from childhood to make herself small, not to meet the eyes of men, not to speak unless addressed, to fold her hands, to lower her gaze, to move through the world like a shadow of something more important. And this self-minimization was expected even in private, for walls had ears, and women had maids, and maids had husbands, and husbands had friends, and friends had opinions, and opinions became ruin faster than any truth ever could. And so discretion became survival, and silence became strategy. And even among other women, one had to be careful, because solidarity was not encouraged, and any display of closeness, of shared dissatisfaction, of joy too loud or curiosity too bold, could be misinterpreted, misunderstood, punished. And in this atmosphere of constant surveillance and self-censorship, strange rituals emerged, not always written down, not always consistent, but always obeyed. Like the rule that a woman must ever sit with her legs apart, not even alone, not even in grief. For grief too had a form, a choreography, and a woman weeping in disarray could be seen as hysterical, as dangerous, as lacking proper decorum. And this obsession with posture extended to everything: how she served food, how she held her hands while spinning wool, how she folded her husband's cloak, how she carried the water jug from the public fountain without swaying her hips too freely. Because even water, even breath, had to be carried modestly, and modesty itself was a labyrinth with no clear map, because its definition shifted with every generation, every city-state, every man's gaze. And in this labyrinth, women had to find their way without light, without guidance, only with the memory of who had been punished before. And one of the cruelest rules of all was that a woman was responsible not just for her own virtue, but for the reputation of every man in her household. For if she was seen walking alone too often, or laughing too brightly, or speaking too sharply, her father, her husband, even her brother could be mocked, shamed, questioned. And so her etiquette became not just personal but political, and the burden of it was unbearable. And yet she bore it, day after day, year after year. And it became her, not by choice, but by repetition. And repetition becomes identity when nothing is allowed to break it, and yet break it some did, and when they did, the punishment was often swift and strange. Not always physical, sometimes just exile from society, a forced marriage, a shaved head, a veiling even inside the home, or a public ritual of purification, designed not to cleanse the body but to humiliate the soul. And so many women learn to bend instead of break, to keep their spirit alive in the narrowest spaces, inside a lullaby, inside a prayer, inside a clever pause before speaking. And these women, though never named in scrolls or stone, pass down a kind of subversive etiquette of their own, teaching daughters how to appear compliant while staying awake inside, how to nod while thinking, how to bow while remembering. And this hidden tradition ran like a secret river beneath the dry texts of historians, and it is from this river we drink tonight, not to pity or patronize, but to understand how much effort it took to survive being good, how much courage it took to exist without vanishing, and how deeply strange a society must be if the very act of standing still with dignity becomes an act of rebellion. And as we close this first chapter of ancient Greek womanhood, we do not walk away with answers, but with questions, sharp and shining like blades between the lines, questions about who gets to define virtue, who benefits from obedience, and who still today is being asked to live by rules no one explains and no one dares to break. To understand the full extent of the rules that governed a woman's life in ancient Greece, we must now step into the sacred, the ceremonial, the strangely divine, because even in religion perhaps, especially in religion, a woman's body was not her own. Her speech was not free. Her movements were choreographed by centuries of tradition and fear disguised as reverence. And although the ancient Greek world was populated with powerful goddesses, Athena the wise, Artemis the wild, Hera the queen. These divine figures did not translate into freedom for mortal women. In fact, they often did the opposite, setting impossible standards, shaping narrow paths where a woman could either be virgin or mother, loyal wife or dangerous temptress, holy priestess or suspicious outsider. And so many found themselves crushed between archetypes they never asked for, expected to embody ideals that were not only contradictory but punishing. And yet, religion was one of the few arenas where women could hold real ritual power, not political or legal, but sacred, symbolic, and it was precisely this power that made the rules more elaborate, more strange, more fraught with conditions. And so we entered the temple not with awe but with caution, for within its marble shadows lay rituals that bound a woman's body to the state, to the gods, to the men who feared what they could not control. And chief among these rituals were the rites of Demeter and Persephone, mother and daughter, goddess of grain and goddess of the underworld. Their myth, a mirror of the lives women were forced to live, stolen from girlhood, buried in marriage, reborn as something quiet and enduring. And the Thesmophoria, the great festival dedicated to them, was led entirely by women. No men allowed, no male eyes to direct or disrupt. And this temporary separation from patriarchy was both empowering and heavily policed. For while the ceremonies were secret, the consequences were not. And a woman who failed to show proper grief for Persephone's descent or gratitude for her return could be seen as unholy, unfeminine, unworthy of respect. And so her gestures had to be precise, her weeping unconvincing, her fasting sincere. And this performance of piety was not just religious duty, it was etiquette under another name. And this blurred line between sacred ritual and social expectation appeared again and again in festivals like the Arctea, where young girls danced as bears for Artemis, shedding their childhood in a symbolic taming of the wild, preparing for future marriage, future silence, future veils. And though the dance was joyous, the lesson beneath it was heavy. Wildness must end, girlhood must bow, and nature must yield to order. And for those selected to serve as priestesses, like the priestess of Athena Polias in Athens, the role came with honor but also severe restrictions. She was chosen for her lineage, her virtue, her purity, and her life became a performance of these ideals, with rules about what she could eat, where she could go, how she could sit, what she could wear. And though she stood at the heart of religious life, her authority was never complete, always circumscribed by the fact that she was still a woman in a world that mistrusted female autonomy. And this paradox of power granted only under conditions of obedience was not lost on the women themselves, though they rarely had the words or the means to rebel. And so rebellion took strange forms, like quiet refusals, ritual inversions, private prayers said in their own names. And these acts, though small, were remembered in myth, if not in history. For every tale of a woman who defied a god or bent a rule or spoke out in the temple became a cautionary story or a whispered legend, but never a law. And so we look at the sacred spaces of ancient Greece not just as places of worship, but as stages where the strange etiquette of womanhood was performed with terrifying precision, where the wrong step could mean disgrace, where the right devotion might bring brief honor but never freedom. And in this way, the temple and the home were not so different, both ruled by rituals designed to control, to tame, to shape a woman's body and soul into something palatable, predictable, sacred yet silent. And perhaps that was the greatest cruelty of all, to give the illusion of holiness while denying true autonomy, to let women hold torches in the night but never light a fire of their own. And so they stood, generation after generation, in procession, in chorus, in prayer, not because they were weak or unaware, but because they knew the cost of stepping outside the circle drawn for them, and they endured, not with passivity but with a kind of spiritual endurance we are only just beginning to understand. There is a kind of fear that pretends to be reverence, and nowhere was that fear more palpable than in the way ancient Greek society approached the female body particularly when it came to blood, to cycles, to that quiet revolution that visited women monthly and was met not with empathy, but with alarm, suspicion, and strange etiquette rules passed down not through law, but through whispers, through glances, through the silent choreography of who could go where, touch what, speak to whom. And so we arrive at one of the most disturbing layers of this etiquette system, the rules of ritual purity, the codes that defined when a woman was clean or unclean, acceptable or invisible, sacred or untouchable. And though these rules varied between city-states, they shared a common language, that of exclusion, of withdrawal, of isolation disguised as tradition. And so a woman on her period was often considered polluted not because she had done anything, but because her body dared to bleed without injury, dared to remind society of its dependency on fertility, dared to operate on a cycle no man could control. And this natural rhythm, instead of being honored, was weaponized into shame. And shame became etiquette, and etiquette became control. And so when her cycle came, she was expected to withdraw from temples, to abstain from certain foods, to avoid public rituals, even if she was a priestess, even if she was the most pious of women, because the blood spoke louder than her prayers, louder than her devotion, louder than her silence. And this exclusion was framed as protection, as sacred boundary. But it was really a banishment, a reminder that her body, though necessary for life, was also feared as wild, as dangerous, as something that must be managed, contained, limited. And so she managed it quietly, discreetly. With rags she washed alone, with herbs she chewed in secret, with pain she never voiced because pain had no place in etiquette. And her silence became part of the ritual, and even when she was not bleeding, her body was always under scrutiny, especially in transitions from girl to woman, from maiden to wife, from wife to mother. And each transition came with its own strange customs, like the requirement that a bride-to-be take ritual baths before marriage, not just for hygiene, but for symbolic purification. And the belief that if a woman miscarried or gave birth to a stillborn child, she was somehow spiritually tainted, in need of cleansing, of withdrawal, of re-entry into society through ritual steps. And while men could purify themselves with a simple dip in the sea, a woman's return to cleanliness was never so simple, always watched, always judged, always lingering in memory like a shadow on her name. And so she internalized the rules, made them muscle memory, made them second nature, not out of belief but necessity, because not knowing the right rule could lead to gossip, to exclusion, to being considered a bad omen. And in some communities, menstruating women were not allowed to cook for their families, touch sacred objects, braid their daughters' hair, or even sleep in the same bed as their husbands. And though no stone tablets declared these laws, they were enforced with the kind of social pressure that makes law irrelevant. And this idea that a woman's body was a site of pollution was not confined to periods, but extended to childbirth, to miscarriage, to any event where her body did what it was made to do. And the strange irony is that while her bleeding made her unclean, it also made her divine. For many goddesses were associated with cycles, with fertility, with the moon. And yet mortal women were denied the honor, made to carry only the burden. And so even in the most intimate spaces, the bathroom, the bedroom, the birthing room, etiquette ruled like a silent overseer, dictating who could enter, who must leave, what must be burned, what must be buried. And these rules carved deep grooves in the lives of women, defining not only what they did, but how they saw themselves. And perhaps the cruelest part of it all was the gaslighting, being told that these rituals were for their own good, their own dignity, their own holiness, when in truth they were just more fences, more invisible chains. And so the woman bled in silence, prayed in silence, purified in silence, and sometimes that silence was so complete it became language, a shared code between mothers and daughters, aunties and nieces, passed through hand gestures and careful timing, through herbs brewed under cover of darkness, Through small rebellions like bathing during her cycle or touching the temple gate anyway, and this quiet resistance did not change the rules, but it reminded the women that they were still whole inside, still wise, still sacred despite what the ritual said, and that sometimes, to survive the strangest etiquette of all, you had to pretend you believed it until one day you didn't. There are few things in life as universal as death, and yet, even in mourning, even in the deepest moments of loss, ancient Greek women were not free to grieve as they chose, for their sorrow was not their own. It was choreographed, prescribed, measured in gestures and garments, and the silence that followed the wail. And so we come to the funerary etiquette imposed upon women, the unwritten script that governed how a daughter, a wife, a mother was to perform her grief. And make no mistake, it was a performance, because true emotion, uncontrolled, unsanctioned, could be dangerous. And so it had to be shaped into forms that men could accept, that society could watch without discomfort, and this paradox that women were expected to be the emotional center of death rituals, but not allowed to truly unravel defined much of their experience. And so when a man died, the first cries to break the silence came from the women, not in private but in public, in ritualized lamentation known as the goose, where wailing was not only allowed but required. And the louder the cry, the deeper the love was assumed T.O.B., but only up to a point, because there was a line between proper grief and excessive mourning, and crossing that line could bring shame, could dishonor the dead, could mark the woman as hysterical or inappropriate, and so she walked a tightrope of pain, expected to tear her hair, but not too much, to beat her chest, but not bruise it, to shed tears that glistened, but did not disfigure. And this strange dance of etiquette was repeated with every loss, with every funeral procession, with every washing of the corpse. And yes, it was the women who washed the body, who prepared it for burial, who anointed it with oils and wrapped it in linen, their hands steady even as their hearts shattered. And yet even this sacred act was limited, for in later periods, laws began to restrict the role of women in funerals, forbidding them from elaborate displays, from long speeches, from joining the procession past a certain point. And always the justification was the same, that women's emotions were too strong, too wild, too disruptive, and yet without them, the rituals meant nothing. And so society relied on women to carry the weight of death, but punished them for carrying it too visibly, and this hypocrisy was felt in the rules of dress as well. For mourning women were expected to wear garments of deep black, to cover their heads, to remove all jewelry, to walk with eyes lowered and voices quieted, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, depending on the closeness of the deceased. And even young girls were subject to this, taught from childhood how to shrink themselves in mourning, how to disappear into the folds of ritualized sorrow. And behind these customs was a deeper truth, that women were seen as the guardians of family memory, the ones who remembered, who preserved, who told the stories of the dead, and yet their storytelling too had rules. And a woman who spoke too fondly, too long, too often about the dead could be accused of clinging, of weakness, of failing to return to her duties. And so memory itself was shaped by etiquette, and the grave became not just a site of loss, but of expectation. And even after burial, women were responsible for maintaining the tombs, bringing offerings, tending the stones, their visits governed by sacred calendars and public scrutiny. And on the days of remembrance, they would kneel in silence, scatter flowers, pour libations, whisper prayers that were half love and half apology for not grieving enough, for grieving too much, for living on. And in this way, death did not end a woman's duty, it deepened it, stretching into the weeks and years that followed, binding her to rituals that reminded her, again and again, of who she had lost and how she was supposed to feel about it. And perhaps most chilling was the unspoken rule that a woman's grief should never interfere with a man's comfort, that her mourning must fit neatly into the spaces society allotted, that even the loss of a child, a husband, a parent must be absorbed with dignity, with grace. with the kind of pain that doesn't make anyone else uncomfortable. And so women became experts at internal grief, at crying without sound, at performing sadness like a sacred duty, and in doing so, they turned mourning into a form of resistance, into a kind of sacred persistence, holding space for memory in a world that asked them to move on. And though their names are mostly forgotten, their wails have not vanished, they echo still. In stones worn smooth by tears, in vases painted with veiled faces, in fragments of poetry where the voice breaks not from art but from ache. And perhaps that is the most enduring etiquette of all, the one that says, carry the sorrow, make it beautiful, but never let it break you where they can see. There is something deeply unsettling in realizing that even the threads on your body can speak louder than your voice. That in ancient Greece, a woman's attire was more than mere covering. It was a declaration, a boundary, a warning, a mirror of her status, her virtue, her silence. And so we enter the world of fabric and form, where etiquette wrapped itself around every inch of a woman's appearance, dictating not only what she wore but how she wore it, when she changed it, how she maintained it, and what message it sent to the watching world. For in the eyes of ancient Greek society, a woman's body was not her own to adorn freely. It was a vessel of family honor, of marital status, of religious duty, and so her clothing became her speech, her armor, and her prison, all in one. And the rules began early. For girls, unmarried and young, were expected to dress modestly but distinctly, often in short kittens, with sleeves pinned at the shoulder, loose enough for freedom of movement, but never so revealing as to attract the wrong kind of gaze. And these garments spoke of innocence, of childhood not yet politicized by the institution of marriage, and when that marriage came, the transformation was immediate, both symbolic and literal. For now her clothing marked her as taken, claimed, bound to another household, and the chiton grew longer, the himation heavier, draped over the head and body like a veil of obedience. And the colors changed. Two bright pigments, like saffron, indigo, crimson, were reserved for upper-class women and for ceremonial days, while most married women dressed in pale, muted tones that signaled humility, discretion, silence, and the himation, a cloak-like garment worn over the shoulder and wrapped around the body, was not just protection from cold but a code of virtue, expected to be worn when outdoors, when in the presence of men, when moving through the agora. And to fail to wrap it properly was not just a fashion error, but a breach of etiquette, a suggestion of carelessness, or even moral laxity. And women were expected to keep their heads covered in many city-states, especially in Athens, where an unveiled woman might be mistaken for a hetaera or seen as lacking modesty. And so the veil, too, became a statement not of faith, but of social compliance, of marital loyalty, of invisibility in public spaces. And even shoes were loaded with meaning, for to wear ornate sandals or dyed leather could be seen as vanity, as excess, unless it was your wedding day or a religious festival. And so most women went barefoot at home and wore simple footwear outside. And then there was hair, the crown of control, where etiquette ran its comb through every strand, and girls might wear their hair long and loose until puberty, but after that, it was to be tied, pinned, braided, sometimes wrapped entirely under cloth, and styles varied, but they always conformed to expectation. Not too elaborate unless you were of high birth, not too plain unless you wanted to be seen as careless, and hair became another code of mourning, of marriage, of motherhood. And upon the death of a husband, a woman might cut her hair short, not just from grief, but as a visible signal of transition. And these visual cues were everywhere, in jewelry too, where rings and pendants and bracelets were permitted, but only in moderation, and never on mourning days, and often chosen not for beauty, but for symbolism: an owl for wisdom, a pomegranate for fertility, a coin of Artemis for protection. And still these choices were watched, commented on, interpreted by other women, by neighbors, by priests, by strangers. And so the dressing ritual each morning was not a private act, but a negotiation, a rehearsal, a defense. And women learned to dress not for comfort, but for survival, to walk with heads lowered, to make sure the hem of their tunic never dragged, to keep fabric pinned high enough to reveal decency but not temptation. And even the scent of their oils mattered, for strong perfumes could suggest flirtation, seduction, even if the woman wore them for her own pleasure. And so scent too became a rule, and with every layer added or removed, the woman's sense of self was shaped and reshaped until she could barely remember where her body ended and the expectations began. And yet, some women found ways to rebel subtly, within the limits, choosing dyes that faded to pink instead of beige, wearing pins that hinted at Dionysian feasts, braiding flowers into their hair during secret rituals. And these small acts became their language, their resistance, their whisper into a world that demanded their silence. And when they stood side by side in temple processions, veiled and wrapped and ordered by age and class, they carried not only offerings but the weight of 1,000,000 unspoken rules stitched into linen, into wool, into gold-threaded hems that shimmered under the sun like chains dressed as celebration. To walk was not simply to move, but to perform, to embody the endless expectations laid upon a woman in ancient Greece, where even the most natural of gestures was weighed and measured, controlled and coded, because the body was never just flesh, but a canvas upon which society painted its rules, its fears, its desires, and to stray from the prescribed choreography could mean scandal, shame, or worse. And so women learned to walk in a way that minimized attention, placing one foot carefully before the other, keeping their knees close, their arms folded or held lightly at their sides, their eyes lowered not because they wished to hide, but because they were taught that visibility was dangerous, that too much presence was a provocation, and the agora, the bustling marketplace where voices rose and deals were struck, was a place a respectable woman could rarely tread unescorted, because her every step was scrutinized, her every glance noted. And in some city-states, a woman walking alone was a spectacle, a warning, a possible invitation to gossip or worse. And this was not only for her protection, but for the honor of her family and husband. And the concept of proper movement extended beyond the streets into the home, where a wife's gestures toward her husband, her children, her servants had to express submission, grace, and temperance. For even a too firm handshake, a too quick nod, a too bold glance could unsettle the fragile order of the household. And in public religious ceremonies, where ritual was already strict, a woman's pose was prescribed to the finest detail, kneeling with hands folded just so, bowing at the correct angle, maintaining a demeanor of pious humility without crossing into self-effacement that would offend the gods or the onlookers. And these demands on the body were a constant rehearsal, a daily balancing act where failure meant censure, gossip, exclusion, and this extended to speech as well, where a woman was expected to speak softly, carefully, never interrupting, never speaking without invitation, and even laughter was to be measured too loud, too frequent, too unrestrained, and a woman risked being labeled frivolous or immoral. And beyond these, there were unwritten rules of touch and proximity, for in a world where male honor was fragile and women's virtue was a currency, a hand extended too eagerly or a shoulder brush too boldly could spark accusations, duels, or exile. And so women moved through space as though walking on thin ice, alert to every gaze, every whisper, every possible misstep. And this constant self-monitoring shaped their very selves, teaching them to shrink, to silence, to disappear. And yet beneath this surface, beneath this imposed stillness, there was life. There were moments of rebellion, brief flashes where women might hold a gaze too long, let a smile linger, touch a child's face with more tenderness than the rules allowed. And these moments, though fleeting, were acts of courage, of humanity, of resistance, because to claim the body was to claim the self, and in ancient Greece, that claim was the most radical of all. To walk was not merely to place one foot before the other, but to enact a silent, ceaseless drama where every movement, every gesture, carried the weight of expectation and the threat of censure. And in ancient Greece, The choreography of a woman's body was a language as strict and complex as any spoken word, a code written in the tilt of the head, the angle of the shoulder, the speed of a step, and the gaze that was cast deliberately downward, away from the eyes of men whose honor depended on her modesty, her restraint, her near invisibility. And this code was not natural, nor was it gentle. It was learned from the cradle, repeated in whispers and corrections from mothers, nurses, tutors, and older sisters, reinforced by public shame and private fear. And the arena where this unspoken rule was most acutely felt was the agora, the marketplace, the bustling heart of the polis, where voices rose in argument and barter, and where a woman's appearance and conduct were subject to the vigilant gaze of strangers, neighbors, and kin alike. For here a woman's presence could unsettle the fragile social order, provoke suspicion, or worse, invite gossip that could stain not only her own name but the honor of her family and husband. And so she was taught to walk lightly, to keep her body compact, her shoulders rounded, her hands folded or loosely clasped in front, her steps measured and quiet, as though she were a ghost passing through a city that refused to fully acknowledge her. And this dance extended beyond mere walking, to encompass all manner of bodily expression, for to gesture with too much animation, to laugh too freely, to breathe too audibly, was to risk being labeled immodest, frivolous, or untrustworthy. And the consequences of such labels were severe, ranging from social exclusion to being barred from participation in religious festivals or even the domestic spheres of power. And beyond the public spaces, these rules persisted in the home, where a wife's movements, in the presence of her husband, his guests, and servants, were tightly controlled, with every nod, every smile, every lowering of the eyes choreographed to express obedience and respect. And any display of impatience or assertiveness could be interpreted as insubordination or worse, unfaithfulness. And this discipline extended to speech as well, where a woman was expected to speak softly, sparingly, and only when spoken to, her voice a mere shadow of the men who surrounded her, for too loud or too frequent speech was a mark of a woman out of control, a threat to the delicate balance of gendered power that kept the city's hierarchy intact. And even laughter was to be moderated too much. Laughter too often could suggest licentiousness, a dangerous abandon, a challenge to social order. And so women learned early how to suppress joy, how to internalize their feelings, how to make silence a form of speech. For silence was safer than words in a world where expression could lead to punishment, and even touch, the most primal form of communication, was regulated with an almost obsessive precision. For in a culture where male honor was fragile and female chastity was currency, a touch extended too readily or received too eagerly could spark accusations of impropriety, violence, or even treason. And so women moved through space as though treading thin ice, alert to every look, every whisper, every possible misstep, and this constant self-monitoring shaped not only their actions, but their sense of self, teaching them to shrink, to silence, to disappear, until the line between who they were and what was expected became blurred beyond recognition. And yet beneath this imposed stillness, beneath the web of fear and control, there were moments of life, of rebellion, of humanity, brief flashes where a woman might hold a gaze a moment too long, let a smile linger just enough to be noticed, touch a child's face with tenderness that defied the rules. And these moments, though fleeting and fragile, were acts of courage and resistance. Because to claim the body was to claim the self. And in ancient Greece, that claim was the most radical of all, a quiet defiance etched into the very fabric of daily life. And beyond the streets and homes, this choreography extended into sacred spaces, where religious rituals demanded even greater discipline, where a priestess's every movement was weighted with symbolic meaning, where deviation could mean expulsion, disgrace, or worse. And so the woman's body, her voice, her very breath became the medium through which she navigated not just society but the divine, walking a line as thin and precarious as the threads of her garment, between reverence and repression, devotion and denial, power and submission, and in this complex dance, the strangest rules of etiquette took form not as arbitrary laws, but as a web of social and spiritual control so tight that few could imagine living outside it. And yet, history whispers that women found ways to weave their own stories between the threads, to carry secrets in their eyes and strength in their silence, to turn obedience into survival, to make their small gestures speak louder than any decree. And it is these stories, the hidden, the overlooked, the quietly defiant, that we now listen for, with patience, with respect, with the hope that in understanding their dance, we might better understand the echoes of control and courage that still shape us today. In the world of ancient Greece, where a woman's movements, speech, and even thoughts were restrained by countless rules, the relationships she could form with other women were equally complicated, layered with both expectation and prohibition. And to understand this is to see how the personal became political, how friendship became both a sanctuary and a battlefield, a place of quiet rebellion and careful negotiation. For the society that sought to control women's bodies also sought to regulate their alliances, their affections, their loyalties, and these connections were often defined by strict hierarchies and rituals, even as they provided rare spaces of comfort and strength. And from an early age, girls were taught to be wary not just of men, but of each other, for solidarity could be dangerous, could threaten social order, could undermine the very structures that held their world together. And so women learned to navigate a complex network of alliances that were as much about survival as about companionship, where trust was measured in secrets shared behind veils, in coded words whispered during festivals, in subtle gestures exchanged during rituals. And yet these relationships, limited as they were, became lifelines, the threads that held together lives otherwise stretched thin by expectation and silence, and within them, women found moments of joy, of laughter, of tenderness, however fleeting. And these moments were precious because they existed in defiance of the strict etiquette that governed every other aspect of their lives. And even the most formal of female gatherings, the rituals honoring goddesses like Artemis or Demeter, though bound by ceremony and control, were opportunities for women to assert identity, to forge bonds, to pass down knowledge not recorded in texts but preserved in memory, in gesture, in song. And this knowledge was subtle, sometimes coded, often overlooked by men who did not understand the depth or the power of female networks, but understood enough to fear them, which is why the women's quarters in households were often places of whispered counsel and quiet strategy, where mothers taught daughters not just to obey, but to endure, not just to appear compliant, but to think, to plan, to resist in ways that would not bring punishment. And these lessons were passed down through generations, hidden beneath layers of duty and decorum, because the public face of womanhood demanded modesty and silence, but the private face was rich with complexity and resilience. And these female bonds were sometimes the only refuge from a world that rendered women invisible, except as extensions of men. And in friendships, women shared not only comfort but secrets of the body, remedies for ailments, stories of loss and longing, and these stories created a shared history, often at odds with the official histories recorded by men. Histories that erased or diminished the female experience, histories that told of warriors and kings but rarely of the women who endured behind closed doors, who nurtured, who taught, who bore the weight of family and community. And so the strange etiquette that demanded silence in public created a language of resistance in private, a language of glances, touches, songs, and coded words that carried meaning only to those who knew how to listen. And it was in this secret world that women could claim a form of agency, however limited, and through it, assert their presence in a society that often sought to erase them. And this duality between public compliance and private defiance defines much of what it meant to be a woman in ancient Greece. And the stories that survived, though sparse, hint at the strength required to live such a divided life, to carry the burden of expectation and the hope of freedom in the same breath. And as we listen to these echoes from the past, we realize that the strangest rules of etiquette were not just about control, but about survival, about creating spaces, however narrow, however hidden, where a woman could still be herself, still connect, still dream. And in this understanding, we honor those quiet acts of courage, those whispered bonds of friendship, those subtle resistances that lived beneath the surface of a world built on rules designed to silence. In the ancient Greek household, the role of a woman was both pivotal and paradoxical, central to the continuation of the family line, yet confined within walls that limited her presence and voice, a paradox that shaped her existence in ways subtle and profound. And understanding her place requires stepping into the rooms where the public gaze softened, but the social rules hardened, where she was expected to be the keeper of the hearth, the nurturer of children, the silent guardian of honor and tradition, yet never fully allowed to step beyond the shadows cast by her husband and male relatives. For her identity was defined less by who she was than by the roles she fulfilled: daughter, wife, mother, and each came with a complex set of expectations that governed not only her actions but her very being. And this governance was not only social but ritualistic, woven into daily routines, sacred ceremonies, and unwritten codes that were as binding as law. Because the household was the microcosm of the polis, the foundation upon which the city-state's stability rested, and if the woman faltered in her duties, the entire structure was believed to be at risk. And so from the moment she married, often as young as 13 or 14, she entered a world where obedience was the highest virtue, where speaking without permission was folly, where her body was a vessel for producing legitimate heirs, ideally sons, who would carry on the family name and property, and where failure in any of these tasks could bring shame not only on her but on her entire household. And this pressure shaped every aspect of her daily life, from how she dressed, to how she spoke, to how she moved through her own home, which was often a place of strict segregation, with men and women occupying separate quarters, separate spaces for dining, sleeping, and leisure. And although she managed the household's daily operations, overseeing servants, preparing food, tending to children, her authority was limited, subordinate to her husband's, and she was expected to embody modesty, humility, and silent strength, never challenging the decisions made by the men around her. And in motherhood, her role deepened yet became more complicated. For while she was praised for bearing children, particularly sons, her status depended on her ability to raise them to be obedient citizens and warriors, to instill in them the values of the polis while keeping herself distant enough not to interfere with their public lives. And daughters, meanwhile, were in to be similarly compliant, learning from their mothers the rules of silence, posture, and submission that would govern their futures. And within this family framework, the strange rules of etiquette became a daily ritual, a performance of roles that reinforced gender hierarchies and social order. And any deviation, whether a sharp word, a neglected duty, or a public display of emotion, was met with criticism, gossip, or punishment. And these punishments could range from social exclusion within the household to more severe sanctions like arranged marriages, public shaming, or in extreme cases, divorce and exile. And all the while, the woman navigated this landscape with a resilience that often goes unrecognized, adapting, surviving, finding moments of quiet agency within the confines of her world. And so the family became both prison and sanctuary, a place where rules were enforced with silent rigor, but also where love, tenderness, and resistance could bloom in hidden corners. And understanding this paradox is key to comprehending the strangest rules of etiquette that governed women's lives in ancient Greece, not as relics of a forgotten past, but as echoes that still resonate in the ways societies control, define, and sometimes celebrate femininity, obedience, and power. Marriage in ancient Greece was not merely a union of two individuals, but a binding contract between families. A transaction imbued with ritual, symbolism, and an intricate web of expectations, particularly for the bride, who from childhood had been prepared to step into a role defined by obedience, modesty, and silence, and her wedding day was not a celebration of love as we might imagine it, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to signify her transition from her father's household to her husband's. And in this performance, every gesture, every garment, every word was scripted, for the bride was expected to embody purity, submission, and the promise of fertility. And she was adorned not just with fine fabrics, but with symbols, garlands of flowers, ribbons dyed in sacred colors, veils that both concealed and proclaimed her new status, and her procession to her new home was accompanied by rituals that underscored her vulnerability and her new obligations, such as the carrying of firebrands, the ritual bath to cleanse her previous identity, and the offering of gifts to the household gods, all of which reminded her and those around her that she was now bound not only to a man, but to the city-state itself. And even the way she entered her husband's house was governed by etiquette, a crossing threshold that symbolized the final break from her past and the total immersion into her new life, where her actions would be scrutinized, her loyalty tested, and her autonomy limited. For the first nights of marriage were not private moments of intimacy, but public affairs watched closely by family members and neighbors, with expectations that she remain chaste until proven fruitful, and any deviation was grounds for suspicion or disgrace. And beyond the ceremony itself, the bride was expected to learn a new set of rules that governed her behavior as a wife, how to speak to her husband, how to manage the household, how to interact with servants, how to represent the family in public spaces, all within a framework that demanded modesty and obedience above all else, and her dress remained a marker of her status, with veils and himmations worn to signal her married state, and to remove them outside the home was considered inappropriate and immodest. And while the husband held legal authority, the wife was expected to wield influence subtly, behind the scenes, often through the management of domestic affairs and the upbringing of children, but never openly. For public assertion of power by a woman was viewed with suspicion, sometimes met with accusations of arrogance or worse. And throughout this new life, the woman's value was often tied to her ability to bear sons, for male heirs ensured the continuation of property and family name, while daughters, though cherished, were often seen as temporary members of the household, until married off to forge alliances, and the education of girls focused heavily on preparing them for these roles, teaching them the skills and etiquette necessary to navigate the complex social fabric, but rarely encouraging independent thought or ambition. And this lifelong training in silence, obedience, and modesty was reinforced by community pressure, where neighbors, relatives, and religious leaders kept watch, ready to correct any behavior that deviated from the expected norms. And punishments for perceived transgressions could be subtle whispers behind a veil, exclusion from communal events, or harsh, including divorce, social ostracism, or worse. And so the woman moved through her new world constantly aware of the eyes upon her, the judgments weighing her down, the expectations shaping every breath she took. And yet, amid the constraints, women found moments of agency, subtle negotiations that allowed them to carve out spaces of influence and affection, and in the quiet care given to children, in the management of household resources, in the support given to other women, and in the whispered prayers for protection and strength, they created a life that was not only survival but also resistance, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit within even the strangest rules of etiquette. In the tightly controlled world of ancient Greek family life, the rules governing a woman's behavior were not only designed to ensure obedience, but also to suppress any hint of dissent or independence. And when conflicts arose, whether through a disagreement with a husband, an accusation of infidelity, or a failure to produce a male heir, the consequences for the woman could be severe and far-reaching. For divorce, while legally possible in some city-states, was often a weapon wielded unevenly, and the stigma attached to a divorced or abandoned woman could effectively exile her from the social fabric, leaving her vulnerable to poverty, loss of children, and the erosion of status, and even within marriage, a wife's options for recourse were limited, as the law generally favored the husband's authority, granting him rights over property, children, and the household, while the wife was expected to endure and adapt, suppressing her grievances for the sake of family honor and social harmony. And this imbalance created an environment where women had to carefully navigate not only the expectations placed upon them, but also the potential pitfalls that came with asserting themselves. For any display of anger, dissatisfaction, or ambition could be interpreted as a threat to the fragile patriarchal order, and the punishment for such threats ranged from social ostracism to more direct forms of control, including physical violence or enforced remarriage. And the community played a significant role in policing these boundaries, with neighbors, relatives, and religious leaders acting as arbiters of morality and decorum, quick to judge and slow to forgive, and gossip served as a powerful tool, capable of ruining reputations and limiting a woman's prospects for remarriage or social support. And the fear of scandal meant that many women lived in a state of constant vigilance, monitoring their words, their actions, even their thoughts, lest they become targets of suspicion, ridicule, or worse. And this pressure extended beyond the individual to affect entire families, whose honor was linked to the behavior of their female members. And so a woman's failure to conform could bring shame not only upon herself, but upon her father, husband, and children. And in some cases, this led to tragic outcomes: disownment, exile, or even suicide, as the weight of expectation and the limits on autonomy became unbearable. And yet, within these harsh realities, there were stories of resilience and quiet resistance, women who found ways to assert themselves through subtle manipulation, through alliances, through the control of household economies, or through the nurturing of powerful networks of female kinship. And these acts, though often hidden from the historical record, reveal a complexity to ancient Greek womanhood that defies the simplistic images of submission and silence, reminding us that even in the strangest rules of etiquette, humanity finds ways to endure, to adapt, and sometimes to quietly rebel. As we move beyond the walls of the household and the quiet corners of family life, we enter a world where the rules governing women's behavior become even more complex and contradictory, a world of religion, public ceremonies, and the fragile politics of the polis, where a woman's presence was at once necessary and suspect, her voice both heard and silenced, and her role defined by a strange combination of reverence and restriction, because in ancient Greece, women were often the keepers of sacred traditions, the caretakers of temples, the ritual specialists who maintained the invisible threads connecting the mortal world to the divine. And yet, this sacred duty came with a web of etiquette rules that bound their bodies, voices, and choices as tightly as any domestic expectation. And in places like Athens, the city that claimed to be the cradle of democracy, women were barred from political participation, forbidden from voting or speaking in the assembly, their citizenship status limited, and their public roles narrowly defined. And yet, paradoxically, their participation in religious festivals and rituals was essential, for goddesses such as Athena, Demeter, Artemis, and Hera embodied ideals and powers that no man could claim, and women who served as priestesses or ritual specialists held a unique, though constrained, form of authority, a power that was both spiritual and political, though carefully circumscribed by rules that dictated their behavior with exacting detail, from the garments they wore, to the purity rituals they observed, to the ways they could move and speak during ceremonies. And this sacred service was one of the few socially sanctioned ways for women to step into public life, but it was also a realm fraught with danger, for any misstep could bring accusations of impiety, loss of position, or social disgrace. And so priestesses lived lives of both honor and fear, their bodies and voices under constant scrutiny, their actions weighed against an impossible standard of perfection, and beyond the temples, in the bustling streets and marketplaces, Women's roles were even more restricted, for the public sphere was dominated by men who saw female presence as a threat to social order, and a woman who ventured too far into public life risked being labeled a hetaera, a courtesan, or worse, and these labels carried heavy stigma. Yet the reality was more nuanced, as many women did participate in commerce, artisanry, and even education, often through informal networks and behind the scenes, their contributions vital, yet largely unrecorded. And within this contradiction lay the essence of ancient Greek women's public life, a constant negotiation between visibility and invisibility, voice and silence, power and submission, and through this negotiation, women found ways to influence their communities, to support one another, and to preserve their identities, despite the strangest and strictest rules that sought to define and confine them. And so as we listen to these stories tonight, we remember that the ancient Greek woman was not merely a passive figure in a male-dominated world, but a complex, resourceful, and resilient individual who navigated a labyrinth of etiquette with courage and grace, carving out spaces of agency in a world that demanded silence. And it is this paradox that makes her story both strange and deeply human. Religion in ancient Greece was not merely a matter of belief, but a framework for social order, and women found themselves both central to and constrained by this system, for their bodies were seen as vessels of both purity and pollution, sacred and dangerous, and the rituals they performed were laden with these contradictions. A dance between reverence and control, and nowhere was this more evident than in the ceremonies dedicated to goddesses such as Demeter, Artemis, and Athena, where women served as priestesses, guardians, and intermediaries between the mortal and divine realms. Yet their roles were strictly regulated, their purity constantly tested, and their freedom limited by rules that dictated not only what they could do, but how they could do it. And these rules extended to their dress, diet, speech, and movements. For a priestess who failed to adhere to them risked losing her status and honor, and the community's trust. And so the path of a religious woman was one of constant vigilance, where every gesture was symbolic, every word measured, every appearance scrutinized, and these expectations were not merely personal but communal. For the sanctity of the polis depended on the correct performance of these rituals, and so the strangest rules of etiquette were woven into the fabric of religious life, creating a complex tapestry of power and limitation. And yet within these strictures, women found ways to exercise agency, to influence, and sometimes to resist, using ritual knowledge, sacred narratives, and communal gatherings as spaces for solidarity and subtle subversion. And the paradox of religious life for women in ancient Greece reveals much about the broader social dynamics at play, how power could be both granted and withheld, how visibility could be a form of control, and how silence could be both oppression and strength. And as we consider these strange rules tonight, we are reminded that the sacred and the social were inseparable, and that to understand the lives of ancient Greek women, we must listen carefully to the echoes of their prayers, their songs, and their silences. In the labyrinth of ancient Greek society, where the public and private blurred yet remained sharply divided, women's lives unfolded hidden webs of intricate expectations that governed not just their households, but their very presence in the wider community. And to step outside these invisible lines was to risk not only personal disgrace, but the unraveling of familial honor and social standing, because a woman's reputation was a fragile commodity, constantly policed by neighbors, relatives, and officials, whose scrutiny extended into the smallest gestures and the briefest encounters. And this policing was enforced not solely through written laws, but through customs, gossip, public opinion, and ritualized surveillance, creating a culture of self-regulation where women internalized the rules so deeply that their behavior became automatic, a constant dance of negotiation between visibility and invisibility, speech and silence, agency and submission, and this culture extended to how women moved through the streets, marketplaces, sanctuaries, and public gatherings, for even casual interactions with men were fraught with danger, potential misinterpretation, and social consequence. And so women learned to control not only their words, but the very tone of their voices, the direction of their gazes, the speed and style of their movements, all in service of projecting modesty, obedience, and respectability. And to falter in this performance was to invite whispers that could spread like wildfire, threatening marriage prospects, family alliances, and personal safety. And within this context, friendships among women took on profound significance, becoming not just social connections but lifelines, spaces where shared experiences could be voiced, vulnerabilities revealed, and subtle strategies devised to navigate a world that sought to contain them. And yet these friendships too were constrained by etiquette, for expressions of affection or dissent had to be carefully managed to avoid suspicion, and even communal gatherings, such as festivals and religious ceremonies, were arenas where women balanced participation with caution, seeking moments of freedom within structures designed to limit them. And in these moments, women found ways to assert identity, to nurture resilience, to pass knowledge and hope through generations. And the complexity of these interactions reveals a society where control and resistance coexisted in fragile balance, where the strangest rules of etiquette were not mere formalities but instruments of power, shaping the lives, bodies, and spirits of women who, despite all constraints, found ways to endure, to adapt, and to subtly challenge the boundaries imposed upon them. And it is in listening to their stories, in reading between the lines of history, that we begin to grasp the depth of their experience and the quiet strength they carried through a world that demanded their silence. Though ancient Greek women were officially excluded from political participation, barred from voting, speaking in assemblies, or holding public office, their influence within the polis was complex and often indirect, a network of hidden power that operated behind the scenes, within the family, the temple, and the community. And this influence was exercised through a variety of means, from managing household alliances and resources, to guiding the moral and religious education of children, to serving as priestesses and ritual specialists whose roles, while circumscribed by strict rules, placed them at the heart of civic spirituality. And these positions granted them a kind of symbolic authority that could be leveraged to affect decisions and social dynamics, often through relationships with powerful men, and through their roles as mothers, wives, and daughters. Women shaped the political landscape in subtle but undeniable ways, crafting alliances, influencing public opinion, and preserving social order, all while navigating a labyrinth of etiquette designed to keep them invisible, yet indispensable, silent yet present, subordinate yet powerful in ways that defied official recognition. And this paradox of power without voice, presence without acknowledgement, defined much of their experience. And it was within this paradox that women found avenues for resistance and agency, employing wit, persuasion, and social acumen to assert their interests and protect their families, and sometimes to subvert the very structures that constrain them. And while the public records of the time rarely acknowledge these forms of female influence, their traces can be found in myths, dramas, and the whispers of history, reminding us that the strangest rules of etiquette were also the stage upon which women enacted some of their greatest acts of survival and subtle defiance. And as we listen to their stories tonight, we uncover not only the constraints, but the creativity and resilience that allowed ancient Greek women to navigate a world both hostile and full of possibility, a world where silence was demanded but never absolute, and where the deepest power often lay hidden in the softest voices. The ancient Greek world was rich with religious mystery cults and secret rites, places where the official public face of worship gave way to more intimate, esoteric experiences, and in these hidden spaces, women often found opportunities to transcend the rigid boundaries imposed upon them in public life. For the mysteries, whether those dedicated to Dionysus, Demeter, Eleusis, or Isis, offered women not only spiritual engagement, but also a form of community and influence that the polis otherwise denied them. And these cults were governed by their own strict codes of conduct, a set of strange rules and rituals that demanded secrecy, purity, and precise observance, creating an environment where women's bodies, voices, and movements were controlled, but also empowered in unique ways, because participation in the mysteries required a level of discipline and devotion that bestowed a kind of sacred authority, a liminal power that could shift the balance of social dynamics when wielded with care. And the women who served as priestesses, initiates, or ritual leaders in these cults walked a delicate line between reverence and control, between submission and power, for while their public roles were circumscribed, their spiritual authority was profound. And through these roles, they shaped not only religious practice, but also social relations, influencing the moral fabric of their communities and the lives of those around them. And yet this influence was never free from scrutiny, for the secret nature of the rites bred suspicion and fear among outsiders, leading to myths and accusations that often painted these women as sorceresses or witches, as bearers of dangerous knowledge that threatened the established order. And this dual perception of sacredness and threat underscores the complex position women occupied in ancient Greek religious life. And it is here, within the mysteries, that we glimpse the strangest rules of etiquette not as mere restrictions, but as frameworks through which women navigated power and vulnerability, control and freedom, silence and voice. And in listening to their stories tonight, we honor the hidden lives of those who move between worlds, carrying rituals and resistance in equal measure, and reminding us that even in the most constrained circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself, to seek connection, and to claim dignity. Within the secretive chambers of religious rites and the shadows of public life, women in ancient Greece cultivated networks of influence and resistance that, while hidden from the formal historical record, reveal a rich tapestry of social dynamics marked by subtle power and strategic agency. And though the strangest rules of etiquette demanded silence and submission, women found ways to speak without words, to assert themselves through ritual, through kinship, and through the careful cultivation of relationships that transcended the limitations imposed by law and custom. For these networks were often the lifeblood of communities, supporting not only spiritual needs but social cohesion, and providing women with spaces where they could share knowledge, resources, and strategies for navigating a world that sought to contain them. And within these spaces, the language of etiquette became both a tool of oppression and a medium of empowerment. For mastery of the unspoken codes allowed women to wield influence in ways that were invisible yet effective. And this duality is most evident in the roles of priestesses and ritual specialists, whose authority rested not on public office but on sacred trust, whose power was mediated through symbols, ceremonies, and the manipulation of meaning. And while their bodies were regulated by strict purity laws and their actions circumscribed by tradition, their positions enabled them to act as intermediaries between mortals and gods, to shape moral discourse, and to act as custodians of communal memory and identity. And beyond the religious sphere, women's social influence extended into family alliances, economic management, and informal education, where they played crucial roles in shaping the next generation and preserving cultural continuity. And it is within this intricate web of social and spiritual relations that we see how women navigated the strangest rules of etiquette, not merely as victims, but as active agents, crafting lives that balanced obedience with subversion, silence with speech, invisibility with presence. And this complexity challenges simplistic narratives of ancient Greek womanhood, revealing a world where power was diffused, contested, and negotiated in every gesture and glance. And as we listen to these echoes tonight, we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience and ingenuity of women who lived and resisted within the strangest rules of etiquette, crafting spaces of dignity and agency in a world that often denied them both. As we reach the final stretch of our journey through the strangest rules of etiquette women were forced to follow in ancient Greece, it is crucial to pause and reflect on the profound impact these regulations had not only on the daily lives of women, but on the very fabric of society itself. For these rules, woven tightly into the social, religious, and political spheres, served as instruments of control that shaped identities, limited freedoms, and dictated behaviors, with a precision that extended far beyond mere custom into the realm of necessity. And yet, within these constraints, women found pockets of resistance, moments of grace, and sparks of agency that challenged the simplistic narrative of passive submission, revealing instead a complex reality of endurance, adaptation, and quiet defiance. And the paradox of these rules is striking. Designed to silence and invisibilize, they also inadvertently created spaces, however narrow and fraught, for women to assert themselves in subtle and profound ways, shaping not only their own destinies, but the moral and cultural landscape of their communities. And as we listen to their stories tonight, we must remember that history is not merely the record of kings and conquerors, but the sum of countless lived experiences, often hidden in silence and shadows. And by giving voice to these experiences, we reclaim a fuller, more nuanced understanding of the ancient world and the women who inhabited it, and in doing so, we honor their lives, their struggles, and their resilience. And we acknowledge that the strangest rules of etiquette were not just rules. They were the battlegrounds where the human spirit fought to remain visible, to remain heard, and to remain free. As we delve deeper into the legacy of these strangest rules of etiquette, it becomes clear that their impact extended far beyond the lifetimes of the women who lived under them, shaping cultural attitudes, social norms, and gender dynamics for centuries to come. And these rules, though rooted in a distant past, echo through history in the ways societies continue to define and regulate femininity, obedience, and power, often in subtle and insidious forms. And the memory of these constraints of silenced voices, restricted bodies, and controlled desires reminds us of the resilience required to endure such oppression, but also warns us of the dangers of forgetting. For forgetting risks repeating the same patterns, the same limitations, the same battles for autonomy and dignity. And so as we listen to these stories tonight, we are called not only to remember, but to reflect, to question how much of these ancient rules still linger in our cultures, in our institutions, in our expectations, and to consider what it means to truly honor the women who lived under them by striving for a world where such strangest rules no longer bind or define. And in this reflection lies both a tribute and a challenge, a call to recognize the strength in silence, the courage in compliance, and the power in subtle defiance, and to ensure that the lessons from these ancient stories inform our present and guide our future toward greater understanding, empathy, and freedom. As we draw this journey to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of history and humanity, where the strangest rules of etiquette that governed ancient Greek women reveal not just a past of restriction and control, but a testament to resilience, adaptation, and quiet resistance. For these women lived lives shaped by expectations that sought to limit their bodies, voices, and choices. Yet within those limits, they carved out spaces of agency, of solidarity, of dignity, often hidden from view but no less real. And in remembering their stories, we honor not only their struggles, but their strength, their complexity, and their enduring humanity. And perhaps the greatest lesson these ancient rules teach us is the power of understanding that to recognize the intricacies of oppression is to begin to dismantle it, that to listen to the silenced is to amplify voices that deserve to be heard, and that in reflecting on these histories, we find pathways toward empathy, respect, and freedom. And so tonight, as you rest and let these words wash over you like a quiet stream, know that you carry forward the memories of those who came before, that you join a lineage of resilience, and that by holding their stories, you keep alive a light that no strange rule can extinguish. A light that continues to shine across the centuries, inviting us all to see, to feel, and to remember.